Okay guys, so in this video I'm going to show you some very basic JavaScript translations and kind of just a strategy how you can implement this yourself. So let's get into it. For the thing that we're going to look at is, well, how we can do client-side translations and some basic things that you should consider when you're handling translations, and just an example how you can build your own translation solution. So just in general, I'm just going to kind of weigh my hands here and say I'm not suggesting that you should do this sort of thing for like a larger project and so forth. This is something where if you have a fairly small website and you have very static translations and you basically just want to allow a user to fairly easily switch language on your page, and it's not a too complicated translation need that you have, you can use a more established library if you want to, but you can also roll your own thing, and I just wanted to show you a way that you can do this. So the basic application we have is that we have this very simple little application that we can translate. We can translate it to Swedish and we can translate it to English. You can go to this link here and we can translate this stuff as well. It's a very small application basically. So one of the things that we want to look at here is the server, which is going to be, well, fairly simple. It's just a little bit of an express server. And here's a little bit of code. And basically, what I'm showing you now is, once again, I'm kind of just warning you, this is not like, there are production applications that are built like this, but I'm not saying that you should write a large-scale application in this manner. I'm just showing you a very basic way of doing it. So if you have your own side project or you have something fairly small and you don't want to go too heavy with your translations, this is a very viable way of doing so. So the basic idea here is that you declare your translations at the page level. In other words, you have a, well, it doesn't have to be this way, but you have a translations directory like this, for example, and then you have each page as a directory, and you simply have a JSON file that contains, well, the translations for each page and the language in which you want to be able to translate that page in. Now, this is a way of doing it. The simplest, there are other considerations we could have for larger applications, but that might be a future video. But the thing you're going for here is basically a uniqueness that is scoped to each page. So in other words, you want the page to be the namespace, if you will, because then it becomes very easy for you to know, okay, am I going to load translations for the home page, or for page number 2 or page number 3, like whatever page you have. It becomes very easy for you to get a holistic understanding of, okay, these are the translations that are existing on that page. Right, so let's continue. And basically what I'm doing here is that I'm just pulling in the different translations into memory, because translations, I mean, you don't actually have to store translations in a database for a smaller application. I mean, just think about it. If you're running a server, you're most likely going to have at least a gigabyte or some such of like memory, and there isn't all that much data we're talking about when we're talking about translations. It's not a lot of data. So unless you have literally like thousands and thousands and thousands of translations, just keeping things in memory like this is actually perfectly fine. And then we serve up all our static content, and basically, well, this is the entire application. So we simply send a file for whichever route we're hitting, and then we have this little thing here, which is our endpoint for getting the language. And basically all that's going to happen here is that, hey, we're going to send a request with the query, and that query is going to, well, just have a query and the page, and we're going to pattern match on the query, which is going to be a language code in this case. So basically, if it's Swedish, we are going to get the Swedish translations, and otherwise we're going to get the English translations. And that in turn is just a nested switch, which is simply going to return the proper JSON file in the JSON format. So if we now go to our page here, we should look at the network and we refresh that, and we can see that, let's basically do that. See that the request goes off, so language is going to be English and the page is going to be home, and the preview here is just, hey, that's the stuff that we're getting, right? If I switch it, we make another request, and now it's going to be Swedish, and the page is still going to be home. And, well, that's basically our entire feature. Notice that when I switched back, it didn't actually make a network call. We will look at that in just a moment. But the basic idea here is that you don't have to go to the network every time to update these translations because they don't change that frequently. So you can actually cache it on the client side of things. So let's have a look at our application code, the actual stuff that is running on the page. But now let's look at the HTML first, just for completeness sake. So this is our entire HTML here. And the basic structure that you should consider here is that, all right, so when you're doing translations on a page and you're doing it in a static manner, the thing that you need to do, if you're not doing it server side, you're doing it client side, you need to somehow express that every element that has text in it in some fashion needs to be able to update that text in some fashion. And the easiest way that I know how to do that is to attach one of the custom attribute like this. And you can basically say, hey, data-translations, and then declare which key that you want this to be associated with. Because remember, every translation needs to have a unique key. And just a tip from me is to don't, even if you think that you can reuse keys and translations on multiple pages, just don't do it, because it's very likely that you are simply going to mess, it's very, very often that you mess this sort of thing up. I've been in many situations where you have a translation that you think in English means the same thing on multiple pages, but depending on which language you're using, the tone to the sentence or the context of what you're trying to say might be very wrong, and you might want to express it a little bit differently. As always, that usually happens. So just in general, be a little bit careful with reusing keys. Try to keep them unique. And then basically we just add this little custom attribute here. And here we can see that our little selector here, which is this selector box up here, is just going to fire off a function on the translator object, which is going to take the target to the value, in other words, one of the language, and then I've hard-coded the page that we're actually on. And the same thing goes for here. It's basically the same code here. And that's really all there is to it. Not much more going on here. Yeah, so basically that's it. So let's have a look at the actual JavaScript that is firing off here. So we have this little translator that is being included, which is this file here. We're going to walk through all of this in just a moment. But basically the idea here is that when the script actually starts, because this is the first thing that's going to fire off on the page, we simply call the translator's load translations function, which is going to take the actual, since we want a translation to start off with, we don't need it in this scenario, because technically what we're doing here is that, hey, we're actually, we are actually sending a file with hard-coded values in it. But we might want to change this to be like contextual, that depending on what we want to do with it. But basically that's it. We're just starting the initialization on page load. And then we add an event listener. And that event listener is simply going to listen for when we change the translation. And the reason why we want to have event listeners is because we want to be able to express that a translation change has happened. So basically, when somebody changes the language, we need to be notified about that, because we have this. And that is this little property here. Now, what is this? Well, this is a template. Or a template placeholder value. So it's very common in most libraries that you have, because that's a very, very common use case for translations. You have some variable value, in this case it's going to be a price, and you want to inject that into the string somehow. Now, on the server that would be pretty simple, because, hey, on the server you actually most likely have all the data that you need in order to make that translation. But if we're doing it on the client side, it gets a little bit trickier. So when we actually bootstrap or change the translation of on the page, we want to be able to express, okay, these translations here, I mean, if it's just static text, we can just make the switch immediately. But imagine that, all right, you switch from, say, Swedish to English or so forth, and the currency needs to change with the actual translation. Then you can't just hard code the currency or things of this nature. It needs to be contextual. It needs to be, as a consumer of this little API, I need to be able to express that, hey, I have this text here, but I want to change one of the values inside of it at runtime, and that's exactly what we're doing here. Now I'm just faking this, but I mean, in reality, what we would have done here is that we would have looked at the language itself. We would have done a switch or something, and gone to the network and simply gotten the sign-up cost, which from the server, but I'm just faking it now with the math.random, and then we're simply grabbing the key for which is called sign-up cost, adding a bunch of like this price to our options, and then we're calling our translate function with the language, the key we want to translate, and the options, so that we can actually translate this nice text. So that's basically it. So here is our translator. So there's a bunch of stuff that's going on here. So we're passing in the window object, we're just extracting the fetch function, and then we're just storing the document. And then we have a local storage, well an in-memory storage for our languages. We could persist this further with using something like local storage as well if we wanted to. And then we have our translation listeners. We're going to touch on that in just a moment. And here are our various functions. So the a very common pattern in JavaScript is that you prefix with an underscore if you want to express that, hey, this is an internal method that isn't supposed to be called from the outside. So all we are actually exposing are these things here. So add a translation listener, translate, and load translations. So when it comes to loading translations, all we're going to take in is the language and the page that we want to load, and then we're simply going to check if we already have a language storage, because remember what we're going to get back is an object, and if we already have if we already loaded that language into memory, there's no need for us to go to the network again. That's why you saw earlier that I didn't actually, when I switched the language first, I got the new language, but the second time I didn't actually get the new language because it's already in this object here. And then we apply our translations, and then we call all the translation listeners. So we can know, we simply go over the page, we do all the translations, and then we simply call all the translation listeners so that they can actually, apply whatever style, whatever changes to translations that they want to make. And if we don't actually have this language, we're simply going to go to the network, call it, call this endpoint that we saw earlier. So we get our translations, parse them, add them, and then do basically the same thing. We're going to apply our translations and then call all the translation listeners. So for translating, or to translate something, we simply pass in the language, the key that represents the text that we want to translate, and then we basically grab the text. And if there is no text, well, hey, we're simply going to return missing. And the reason why we want to do this is because it's kind of, it's very common that there's a mismatch between translations on the page and translations on the server, that somebody forgot to add a key, or there's a key that changed its name and so forth. So it's kind of nice to return some type of default value so that you can actually see if something is missing on the page when you're working. And then we grab all our options, and basically what we're going to do here is we're going to create a regex, a global one, which is going to simply be, well, these curly braces here. And as you can see, this lines up with this style here. So what's going to happen now is that we're simply going to loop through, and we're going to replace all the instances we find of this template value with the actual value that we have, and or that we're extracting from the options. And that's about it. And then we have our add translations listener, which is just going to be a function that we push to our little array here, which was what we saw. Let's just persist that there, which is exactly what we're doing here, just so that we can hook into that fact that, all right, something updated on the page or a translation has now been loaded or something of that nature, so we can actually make our dynamic updates. And when we call translation listeners, so what we're going to do is that we are going to loop over all of them, and we're simply going to call we're going to call each function, because that's what we're doing here. We're pushing functions to this little array here, and then we're going to call each function with the language that is now loaded. And here's our apply translations function, which is basically just going to grab all the elements that we want to translate on the page, and that's where this hook comes in here. So we're going to grab all of the elements that has this attribute, and then we're going to loop through all of them, and we're going to grab the attribute or the key, and then we're simply like the value that's inside of this key, and we're simply going to go to our translations here, and we're going to check if we can actually find a translation that is associated with this key. And if we find that translation, hey, we set the element's text content, like the internal text of the element, to that translation, and otherwise we're simply going to log out some type of warning or something like that. And finally here we instantiate the actual translator. Now this is done without any type of bundling or anything like that. You can make this a much more elaborate setup if you want to. But I just wanted to show you some basic concepts for how you can do some very simple client-side translations for smaller projects if that's what you're going for. So yeah, that's about it really. So this is a very basic example of how you can start thinking about making some basic translations on your website. Have a great day.